A doctor, a pro wrestler, and one of the earliest professional football players walk into a bar. Same guy. A lot of wrestling history is filled with character building, kayfabe accomplishments, and hyped up lies. Dr. Benjamin Franklin Roller didn't need any of that. His real life seemed far-fetched. This is like the story of Forrest Gump if he were an actual genius and, not from Alabama. Doc Roller is truly one of the most interesting human beings to ever become a pro wrestler, but am I mostly covering him so I can do a bunch of Dr. Wrestling Move puns? Yes, I am. Doc Roller wasn't a wrestler with a doctor gimmick. He was a literal doctor who also pro wrestled. The only time I'd like my doctor to be around that much CTE is if he's trying to cure it. The copay suicida. However, there's even more to his story. Ben was also a college athlete, professional football player, a university professor, a physical culture advocate, on top of being a wrestling headliner and literal doctor. There is almost nothing out there on Doc Roller. Like, everything I know about him comes from his story intersecting someone else I was looking into. In fact, there's like 2 pictures of him. I don't know how I'm gonna make this video. So my primary source today is gonna be a big ol' article from Legacy of Wrestling, written by Tim Hornbaker, the dude who wrote Death of the Territories. But the wrestling puns, that's all me. The Hippotoss. As always, this is pro wrestling history all the way back in the 1800s and into the early 1900s, so everything should be taken with a hearty, I don't know, man. I don't know, man. Benjamin Franklin Roller was born July 1st, 1876, near Newman in Douglas County, Illinois. He came from a farming family, the 5th child of Philip J. Roller and Emily Roller. Like a lot of young men raised on a farm, he developed real physical strength, working before he ever became an actual athlete. I just covered Farmer Burns if you want to hear about the ultimate farm boy turned pro wrestler. Roller's mom also pushed him towards education, and that became just as important as sports. And apparently, at just 14 years old, Roller took the state examination to become a teacher, and he passed. But then some square decided to ruin the plotline to this 1990s comedy classic. In 1892, Ben met DePaul University football coach A.N. Sager, who helped steer him towards the school in Greencastle, Indiana. So this is like not DePaul that you probably know of, like of Paul. It's a different DePaul, P-A-U-W. Roller arrived poor and inexperienced, first entering prep school before becoming a full college student. Paid his way through work, including jobs at a dry goods store and washing dishes. At DePaul, Ben was popular and active. He served as his class president for 3 years and sang baritone in the Glee Club. Ben also became one of the school's best football players. Known at the time as Frank Roller, he spent 1895 through 1897 playing guard, fullback, and kicker. In October 1897, he attended Farmer Burns versus Dan McLeod's world title match. At the Grand Opera House in Indianapolis, McLeod won 2 out of 3 falls, and the match made a serious impression on Doc Roller. It was his first real exposure to professional wrestling, and he was hooked. So to recap, Farmer basically got his teaching degree, singer, class president, football star, and now he's a mark. Roller graduated in 1898 with honors. That same year, Ben also served as secretary for the Indiana Intercollegiate Athletic Association. By then, people in athletic circles were taking notice of him. He stood a little over 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds. For his era, that was physically imposing. The Chicago Athletic Association then recruited him for a meet with the New York Athletic Club, June of 1898, and Roller won the discus throw with a toss of 106 feet. Compared to today, not very good, but to put that into perspective, Robert Garrett at the 1896 Athens Olympics won discus with a throw that was about 95 feet and 8 inches. So dude just picked up a discus and was like, yeah, I'm as good as an Olympian, whatever. Also that same year, Roller played with the Pittsburgh Athletic Club, making him one of the earliest people to be paid for club-based professional football. And I have to dig into this more, but he has to literally be the first football player to fall back onto pro wrestling, like a absolute hero to defensive ends who blow out their knee in training camp and end up at the Performance Center. In fall of 1898, Roller entered the University of Pennsylvania to pursue his medical degree. Since he already used his college football eligibility at DePaul, he instead continued playing football on the intramural level. And sure, intramurals, who gives a shit, but remember the time right here, college football is just now exploding, but really for a handful of schools like Yale and Princeton, pro football's not a thing really. So any amount of football was like kind of cool to do. Roller graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1902 with his medical degree and received the Saunders Obstetric Prize. So obstetrics means Doc was basically focused on like pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum stuff. I mean, I'm not a doctor, I don't know. Scope Slam. Ugh. I should have stopped at Kobe Suicida. Roller stayed at Penn, working as an assistant for Dr. Barton Cook Hurst, a prominent professor in his field. Roller also served as chief of the women's clinic and reportedly wrote chapters on anesthesia for Hurst's gynecology book. At the same time, through 1902, Doc was still playing professional football in Philadelphia. On top of it all, he also opened his own medical office in Philly. His med career even gained attention in early 1903 when he publicly advocated for the use of formalin solution in treating tuberculosis patients. Newspapers reported on this successful treatment, giving him national publicity. By late 1903, Roller was still playing football, now for the Philadelphia Athletics, and also became football coach at Pennsylvania Railroad YMCA. But his time in Philly was coming to a close. As he ended his practice, moved across the country to Seattle, where he accepted a position at the University of Washington. In Seattle, Doc kept doing Doc stuff. He lectured at the college, he worked in physical culture, he became the director for the Seattle Athletic Club, and maintained his own private practice. Doc also invested in property, which weirdly leads him to getting into pro wrestling. Roller needed to raise roughly $10,000 quickly or risk losing everything he put into an investment. For whatever reason, he thought the best course was pro wrestling. So there you go, millennials who can't afford a house. Quit buying your Starbucks and start pro wrestling, I guess. On September 22nd, 1906, Roller entered the pro wrestling world in Seattle against Jack Karki. He defeated Karki and reportedly earned somewhere between $300 to $1,600, depending on the source. Karki's manager and trainer, Joe Carroll, quickly recognized Roller's potential. Carroll was a veteran of wrestling figure, a promoter, manager, and hustler. He had previously traveled with a young Frank Gotch through the Yukon and Alaska, and was directly connected to the Gotch Farmer Burns wrestling circle. Carroll understood that Doc was a unique prospect. He was a real doctor, a former football player, a university guy. He was someone who could be built up as a major contender to Frank Gotch and make everyone a lot of money. Now, Doc is entering a pro wrestling world that is still a hybrid of real enough matches and scripted angles. While we're still about 2 decades from the big switchover, people are already starting to think about stringing together a series of matches for what we would call a feud. They're thinking, hey, if this guy wins, it's probably better for business than if this guy wins. They're also starting to think, maybe a 9-hour match of people hugging each other isn't the most entertaining thing. Carroll, Frank Gotch, Farmer Burns, and the wrestlers in their circle knew how to work with these ideas. They also knew how to protect reputations, create betting interest, work the newspapers, and make matches look real enough to keep the public invested. Doc's first major step came October 12, 1906 in Seattle. There he faced Frank Gotch in a special handicap match. So this isn't like a 2-on-1 or 3-on-1 handicap match. Basically, the rule here is that Frank has to toss Doc, and Doc just has to survive. If you don't know Frank Gotch, he was already an established star. The Roller lasted the hour, survived, basically putting him over as a legit threat. $1 million dream, but that's just how much it is for a one-night stay at a hospital. Our healthcare system is deeply broken. That result worked exactly as intended. Roller looked like a natural. Gotch and Farmer Burns also both praised Doc publicly, setting up the idea of future matches between Roller and Gotch. It's also important to note that not only during this time, but throughout his entire career, he never stops being a doctor, which is crazy. Like, imagine if your OBGYN missed your delivery date because he's off fighting Mantar. Meanwhile, in wrestling, Carroll and Farmer Burns were careful. They didn't overexpose Roller too quickly. They also didn't put him in the ring with dangerous or unpredictable opponents. So during this period, sure, it's slowly becoming more and more rigged, but basically all of these old school guys could actually wrestle. Like, they could absolutely wreck someone who couldn't. So they didn't want to put Doc in the ring with someone who would go into business for themselves and just destroy this Frank Gotch Doc Roller matchup. Throughout 1907 and into 1908, Doc Roller was booked as one of the more cleaner, more respectable figures in a sport that already had a reputation problem. The same newspapers that were already calling wrestling rigged in places like Chicago praised Roller for clean wrestling and superior skill. You know, Doc was a professional. He wouldn't be involved in such chicanery, you know, and also as a doctor, he can like medically diagnose his matches as real. Scalpel, armbar, head scissors. January 24th, 1908, Roller faced Farmer Burns in Seattle. Burns is on a career downswing here, but he's still one of the most famous, respected figures in all of wrestling. So getting a win over the Farmer bumps Doc higher in the eyes of the fans. Roller won in 2 straight falls, the match lasting more than 80 minutes. Afterwards, Farmer Burns praised Doc Roller, calling him the best man he had met besides Gotch, and saying that he was a future champion. I mean, how many thousands of times has this exact angle happened in pro wrestling history? The up-and-coming star beats the established vet. They, shake hands, maybe do that little point, and all of a sudden, new guy's over. The next important name in Roller's ascent was Fred Beell. Beell was a major wrestling star who had famously beaten Gotch for the American title 2 years earlier. Titles, of course, being incredibly subjective in this era. If Roller could beat Beell convincingly, without making the whole thing look too arranged, it would further establish him as a worthy opponent for Frank Gotch. And that is exactly what happened May 14th, 1908 in Seattle. Roller won 2 straight falls, and a rematch was quickly arranged for May 22nd. Most gamblers expected Beell to get his win back, because that was a common pattern in wrestling promotion. Instead, Roller won again in 2 straight falls. Then, July 1st, 1908 in Seattle, Roller challenged Gotch. The two drew a gate of roughly $15,000, and while Gotch was the betting favorite, it wasn't overwhelming. During the first fall, Roller escaped Gotch's famous toe hold several times, but eventually, Gotch won the first fall in 15 minutes and 25 seconds, and then took the second in 25 minutes and 51 seconds. Roller had his moments, but Gotch clearly controlled the match. Then in 1909, they went on tour. In April, Doc made his first Midwestern appearances in places like Danville and Chicago before challenging Gotch again April 27th in Kansas City. Gotch won again, but the match drew 5,500 fans and was praised as clean, fast, clever, and scientific. Now, obviously, it didn't work for old Gotchamania to put Doc Roller over, so they threw the kid a secondary title. On September 2nd, 1909, Roller defeated Charles Olson in Portland for a claim to a world title. While this looked like a crowning moment, we all got early 1900s swerved. The next night in Seattle, he lost to Henry Ordeman, a pupil of Burns and Gotch. Roller was thrown to the mat after about 66 minutes, apparently knocked unconscious, and was carried from the ring. And this type of injury became part of Doc Roller's whole thing. Like, sometimes, sure, he probably accidentally got hurt, but he started using this as a performance device. Doc would suffer broken ribs, shoulder injuries, knockouts, or anything else that worked to protect him in a defeat or make him look courageous in a victory. The injury gimmick became one of his trademarks. And an always injured doctor is kind of like Pagliacci being a sad clown, like, a doctor. I am also a doctor. September 1909, Roller and Joe Carroll parted ways. Apparently, it ended badly, but Roller then took on Jack Curley as his manager. I also recently covered Jack Curley, very important early 1900s manager for both wrestling and boxing. As Roller worked with Curley, he won several handicap matches during the tour, including a 15-minute handicap match win over Gotch in Detroit, New York City, and St. Louis, and then a 60-minute handicap match win over Stanislaus Labisco in Kansas City. In 1910, Roller and Curly went to Europe looking for new opponents. That led to August 8th, 1910, in London, when he faced the great Gama of India. There, Roller lost 2 straight falls. Supposedly, this match was set up to make Gama look like a big deal, crushing Doc Roller in 2 straight falls. The plan here was for Jack Curly to get him over to America so that he could book him against Frank Gotch, but it never happened. While in Europe, Roller and Curly also met up with George Hackenschmidt, who was interested in returning to the United States for a second tour. Curly arranged a 6-week deal, and Roller became part of it all. He served as both an opponent and his trainer. All this led to a big blow-off match between Hackenschmidt and old rival Frank Gotch. As we know, Roller was Hack's training partner and allegedly, in practice, injured George's knee. During the match, Gotch had Hack's set knee, and Frank beat Hackenschmidt in 2 straight falls. It's kind of fun to think about because you have sort of 2 options here. The match was legitimate, and Doc kind of put in the hit on George's knee in practice, or this was all scripted and Doc was passing on his own injury selling to Hackenschmidt so that Frank would get a win. After separating from Curly, Roller spent the next several years as a traveling wrestling star. He worked across the United States and Canada, from Boston to Seattle, Texas to the Midwest, giving speeches, teaching holds, and of course wrestling matches. But here's kind of the fun part about Doc Roller. Way before Flair or Harley or even Terry Funk, he was doing the thing where he would go to the local promotion, wrestle the local top guy, and make him look good while still winning by the skin of his teeth and getting out of there. I'm sorry he didn't make it. Tombstone. Then Doc started working with the new generation. In January 1912, in Fremont, Nebraska, he faced Joe Stecher. Doc was one of the few men to beat the future 1915 world champion, although technically, Stecher hadn't quite turned pro. May 14th, 1913, in Lexington, Kentucky, he defeated Ed the Strangler Lewis, who was then still pretty early in his career. By 1915, Doc Roller was in New York, taking part in tournaments, and of course, running his medical practice. His last important match comes in 1918. On March 13th, Doc again faced Ed the Strangler Lewis, this time in Atlanta, and this time, Lewis beat him. During the match, Doc was, of course, injured, and afterwards announced his retirement. It took a minute. He was completely out of the game by 1919. Doc's wrestling career lasted just over 12 years. During that time, he crossed paths with a crazy list of early wrestling names: Farmer Burns, Frank Gotch, Fred Beell, George Hackenschmidt, Greg Gama, Stanislaus Obisco, Yusuf Mahmount, Charles Cutler, Ed the Strangler Lewis, Joe Stecher, and Earl Caddick. And while he wasn't quite the John Cena or Stone Cold Steve Austin of his era, he was a very important part of the machine that was building this new world of pro wrestling. In his later years, Roller became critical of modern pro wrestling. Shortly before his death, the Associated Press interviewed him, and he expressed disgust with the direction pro wrestling was going in. Imagine if Doc lived long enough to see Isaac Yankem. He could have hated him for being a phony and for being a dentist. Doc Roller died in New York, April 1933, reportedly of pneumonia, at just 56 years old. But what Doc left behind was one of the craziest stories in wrestling history. A real athlete, a real doctor, that came into pro wrestling at a time to help patch up the cracks in the dam of its legitimacy. And Doc was very smart in that he understood this new scripted world of pro wrestling wasn't about the wins anymore. It was about giving the audience something to emotionally latch onto. It was about letting your opponent have enough dignity to still matter after you left town. And it was about presenting pro wrestling as a legitimate art form and discipline, even if the industry's technically full of shit. You know what? Joke's on you. There's nothing on this side of the paper. So everything in your life is an illusion. Escape the matrix while you still have a chance.